Welcome to What's Unique in California. Today is sponsored by the Workforce Development Board of Ventura County. My name is Anna. I'm the digital media and event strategist here at the California Employers Association, and we again want to just thank you for spending your morning with us. Before we get into today's training, just a couple details to go over with you. So as you see, your audio is muted for today's presentation, but there are going to be lots of opportunities to engage during the training, like you're already doing so in the chat. So if you have any questions about the content, you can enter those into the Q&A box at any time, and we'll do our best to address them as we go. Today, we are lucky to have two members of our HR team, Vicky and Eli, who will be watching the Q&A and ready to help out. So if you end up putting a question in the chat, I'll probably just ping you and ask you to move that over to the Q&A, just so that we can make sure that gets answered for you in a structured fashion. Handouts were sent out in yesterday's reminder email. However, I know we did have a couple of registrations this morning. We're so glad you were able to join us. So what I'm going to do is drop that PDF into the chat shortly. Once you see the file and icon pop up, if you just click it, it'll download locally to your drive. Again, I'll be watching the chat if you have any issues accessing that PDF, and I'm more than happy to get that to you one way or another. As you see when you logged on, the webinar is being recorded, and our team, over at Ventura County will be reaching out once that is going to be available for playback. So make sure you are active on their list to be able to access that recording. And then last but not least, we'll be inviting you to share your feedback at the end of today's training by participating in a very brief survey. So it's 5 questions. They're mostly multiple choice, and it generally takes about a minute to a minute and a half to complete. But the feedback that you share with us in those 5 questions, we really do take to heart here at CEA. We share them with our partners over at Ventura County, and we just collectively make sure that we are meeting and hopefully exceeding your expectations with trainings like these. So if you take the minute at the end, there'll be a slide with a QR code, and then I've also set it up so once you click out of Zoom, a browser window should pop up. All you have to do is click opt in to participate. And this is also how you share your input on what types of trainings you'd like to see in the future. So that is a really great way to have your voice heard there. So again, our training today is brought to you by our partners over at Ventura County. And today we're so happy to be joined by Rebecca Tafoya, who is the Business Solutions Specialist, who's going to share more about the resources available to employers like you. Hi, Rebecca.
Hi, thank you so much, Anna, for the kind introduction. My name is Rebecca Tafoya. I'm a Business Solutions Specialist with the Workforce Development Board of Ventura County. And I just wanted to remind everyone of our amazing complimentary human resources hotline. We can provide guidance on basically hiring and firing processes, paid sick leave, breaks, lunches, employee handbooks, harassment prevention, and remote workers. The hotline is available Monday through Friday. I believe it's from 8 to 5, and it's no cost. So please feel free to use it or to share with anyone who might feel benefits from the hotline. And also we do provide services to businesses, anything from on-the-job training to custom hiring events, as well as job fairs. I'm going to go ahead and leave my contact information in the chat if anybody would like to reach out to me for anything further, and I'll have it back on over to Anna and enjoy the webinar. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you, Rebecca, Cynthia, Colleen, the other Rebecca, Micah, everybody on the hardworking Ventura team for bringing this series together to employers in your area. So now I'd love to introduce our trainer today. We have Juliana Gabriel, who is our Senior Compliance Director, who's delivering the presentation. And then we have Eli Nunez, one of our HR directors, and Vicky Simpson, our Senior HR Business Partner. So you are in great hands today, and I will give it over to Gigi.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you, Rebecca, and a big thanks again to the Development Board of Ventura County for sponsoring this event today. Now, for those of you who are joining us for the first time, I would like to introduce California Employers Association, or CEA. You may chat with us if you take advantage of calling into that HR hotline, but you can also join us as a CEA member. We have members located throughout the state of California and beyond, and our goal is to provide you peace of mind with your HR compliance solutions. So what our members get access to, just to give you a little idea, we have access to hundreds of sample forms, policies, toolkits, which we're constantly keeping up to date with all of California's changing requirements. And we can also help you out with a number of HR projects. If you need a customized employee handbook, for example, I-9 audit, assistance with a workplace investigation, training for your staff, we can help you out with all of those types of projects. We have our website listed there below, and you can also call our direct line that we have on this slide. We're happy to answer your questions about membership. Now, I do want to note that this presentation today is for educational purposes only and should not be relied upon as legal advice. CEA is not a law firm, and we cannot give you legal advice either when you're calling into the hotline or asking questions on this training. We're always just giving you general guidance and best practices. But as Anna mentioned, you're more than welcome to ask us questions about the content today. So go ahead and direct those to the Q&A box, and we will answer those as we go throughout the training. So please take advantage of that. All right, so what is on our agenda today? Well, we have a lot to talk about in terms of what's unique in California, and we're really going to look at kind of the entire life cycle of the employee, starting with hiring best practices. So we have a number of restrictions when it comes to what we're allowed to rely on when it comes to hiring, and also a number of forms that we have to give out at the time of onboarding. So we'll cover that. And then some other very important topics in California include wage and hour rules. We have so many things to consider with overtime, meal and rest breaks. We'll talk about that, as well as leaves of absence. In California, there's around 30 different leave laws that could apply to an employer, and we're going to go over some of the key ones today that come up most often. Then we'll get into the end of the employment relationship. What paperwork do you need? Final paycheck requirements are very stringent in California. And then we'll close out with some of the mandatory training requirements for your staff. So starting with recruiting and hiring best practices, I want to start the conversation with the at-will employment relationship in California. So this is the default. The assumption is that an employee that works for you is at will, and that means that they can be terminated at any time with or without cause or with or without advance notice. Now, of course, we can't terminate someone for an unlawful reason. For example, if they filed a harassment complaint or needed a reasonable accommodation or a leave of absence, that wouldn't be a reason that we could turn around and terminate someone. But as long as it's for a lawful reason. Some exceptions to that, if you have a collective bargaining agreement, oftentimes employees will have specific steps or disciplinary action they're entitled to before being terminated. And sometimes that's also the case if you have an executive contract, for example, that calls for cause termination. But otherwise, most employees are going to be at will. And we want to make sure that we're consistent about this in all of our offer letters with new hires. We want to make sure we have an at-will policy in our employee handbook because we don't want to undo that. We don't want to start making promises to employees and we could actually change the nature of the at-will relationship. So it's a really good idea to check your handbook and make sure that it actually grants only one person or a few people the authority to change the at-will relationship. So for example, maybe it's just the CEO that can change that and they need to do that in writing. That can provide you additional protection. We also want to train our managers on that they shouldn't make any sort of guarantees or promises about disciplinary action happening prior to a termination. All right, now let's talk about some of the restrictions in hiring in California. A big one is this salary history ban that went into effect around 2018. And what it does is it requires all employers, they're prohibited from asking about or relying on an applicant's salary history as a factor in hiring. So you should not be asking an applicant about what they earned in a previous role or what benefits they might have had. That's off limit. And the reason being is the legislature is concerned about the gender wage gap. And that if, for example, women in interviews are required to give their salary that's maybe less than what a man is earning, that will continue to be perpetuated, that they'll be continued to be offered a lower salary. So that was really kind of the motivation behind the law, but it applies to everyone across the board. Now, we are permitted to ask about salary expectations, meaning what does someone want to earn or be paid in the position? We can ask about that. It's okay if someone makes a voluntary disclosure about what they're earning in their current job. If they share that, you didn't prompt them at all, they just wanted to share that information maybe as part of the negotiation with you and what you're going to pay them, then that's okay at that point to rely on them. But we don't want to prompt them to share this information. And we want to make sure we're removing those types of questions from job applications and training our hiring managers that they shouldn't be asking for that info in interviews. We also have pay transparency laws in California, and we're not the only state to focus on this in recent years, but it's been expanded here. And for all employers, what we need to remember is that anytime an applicant or an employee requests the pay scale for their current position, we have to provide them that information upon request. And the pay scale is defined as the salary or hourly wage range that an employer reasonably expects to pay for the position. So for every job position, we should look at, well, who is the lowest paid person all the way to the highest paid person in that position? Our range should at least include those data points. Sometimes employers confuse that with a hiring or starting salary. That would not include the entire pay scale. Then if you have 15 or more employees, we also have to include this information in any job posting. So you might have seen this more in recent years with the change in law that you've started to see the pay scale being posted in those job postings. So that is a requirement if you meet that threshold of 15 or more employees. You can also additionally include the hiring range to give people a reasonable expectation of where they may start, but we do have to have that entire range in there. Another important area is pre-employment tests. And in California, we have to make sure that if we do have any sort of pre-employment test, that we as the employer are always paying for all costs. It should never be the applicant that's taking on the cost of that test. Now, one of the big ones that comes up is pre-employment drug tests. And this is restricted to only after we've extended a conditional job offer. So we cannot drug test all of our candidates. It has to be the individual that we've selected for the position contingent on them passing that drug test. Now, there are also special rules now for cannabis within the recent years that employers can only test for what's known as active THC, meaning at the time of the test, it's actively in somebody's system. They cannot test for what's known as non-psychoactive components, meaning that maybe someone used it a few days ago or a few weeks ago. And the reason being that cannabis use that's off the job and away from the workplace is now protected in California. When it comes to physical and mental examinations, again, you can only have these types of tests after extending a conditional employment offer. And you also have to make sure that that examination is job related and consistent with business necessity, meaning it's actually based on the specific duties that are required of the job. There was a case a number of years ago where a corporation required applicants to undergo a lifting test to see if they could lift a certain amount of weight. And it was later shown that that really wasn't needed for the specific job that they were hiring for. And it ended up filtering out a lot of women candidates who would have otherwise been qualified. And so they brought an adverse impact discrimination class action against the employer. So we want to make sure that we're careful with those types of tests to begin with and have a competent HR professional review those types of examinations for you. All right, in California, we also have what's known as the Fair Chance Act, which puts prohibitions on using criminal history in the hiring process if you have 5 or more employees. This law was also known as ban the box, meaning that they want to remove that question from job applications, whether someone's ever been convicted of a crime. So here's what's required. If you have 5 or more employees, you cannot inquire into criminal history during the interview process. So that means you shouldn't be asking the applicant questions about their criminal history or conducting that background check until you have extended that conditional job offer. Now, once you've done that, you can ask the candidate questions about it. You can conduct that background check. But just because something comes up in the background check does not mean you can automatically deny the position. So in California, you have to show that that conviction history has a direct and adverse relationship with the specific duties of the job. So let me give you an example of what that might look like. Let's say you're hiring for a driver position and it comes up in the background check that that person has multiple recent DUIs. You could probably make a pretty strong argument that that could pose a safety issue, that there would be a direct and adverse relationship with the job. But if you were hiring for a cashier position, now that argument starts to get a little more difficult. And you always have to make an individualized assessment where you're looking at specific factors on a case by case basis when you're deciding whether to deny the job or not. Now, let's say you are able to show that it would have a direct and adverse relationship with the job. There's still a number of notification requirements that you would need to go through before denying the position. So you would have to first provide a written notification to the applicant of your preliminary decision, and you would need to include the specific conviction that you're relying on, a copy of the conviction history report, and then also you need to let the applicant know that they have a right to respond within 5 days, and they could challenge the accuracy of that conviction history. They might say, well, that's my name, but I never, committed that crime. Or they might say, hey, I have some mitigating circumstances to share. I've been in AA, I've been sober for 2 years. And you would have to take a holistic approach at looking at that information that they provide to you. Now, if you still decide to ultimately deny the employment, you need to provide the applicant a final letter known as an adverse action notice, notifying them of your decision, and it also needs to inform the applicant that they could file a claim with the Civil Rights Department if they believe that their rights were not followed. So as you can see, very extensive protections in California when it comes to criminal history. All right, so let's talk about required hiring forms. We have quite a long list to go over, so I'm going to go over each of these with you at a high level. And this is only the first page, so we have quite a list here. So starting with the I-9 form, this is the federally required form that determines whether someone is authorized to work in the United States. Now, section 1 of that form is the employee section of the form, and that needs to be completed on day 1 of employment. Section 2 is the employer part of the form, and that's where you're looking at the documents that the person has provided you to show their identity and confirm they're authorized to work, and that needs to be completed within 3 business days of hire. So for example, if someone starts work on Monday, then under most circumstances, you would need to have that section 2 completed by Thursday of that week. We also have our forms for tax withholding. So the federal form is the W-4 form. You also have to have your employees complete the California version, the DE-4 form. Then we have a number of acknowledgments that we have to get from that employee, and we should save to their personnel file. So the first one is the acknowledgement of your injury and illness prevention program. All employers should have this IIPP that focuses on reducing safety hazards in the workplace. One of our required policies is our discrimination and harassment prevention policy. It's required that you have that in California, and at the time of hire, your new hires need to acknowledge that policy. Additionally, all new hires need to be provided a lactation accommodation notice that goes over pumping rights at work. And then also some notices from the Civil Rights Department. So the pregnancy disability leave notice regarding PDL rights, the victims of crime and abuse notice. And this notice is going to be updated this year. The Civil Rights Department has been tasked with updating it by July 1 of this year since that law was expanded. And so be on the lookout for that. That form's going to need to be provided at the time of hire and then also actually distributed to all employees annually. But I have not seen the Civil Rights Department yet publish that updated version. And then also the Civil Rights Department sexual harassment notice. All right, we are almost there, a few more. So we have Form DE 2515. That is the EDD's form on the state disability insurance program for someone who is experiencing an injury or illness and they apply for wage replacement while they're off work. And then similarly, Form DE 2511, that's the paid family leave brochure that provides for wage replacement when someone's caring for a family member with a serious health condition, baby bonding leaves. Those are some of the most common times that PFL is used. Then we're going to provide our facts about workers' compensation brochure and the opportunity for someone to pre-designate their physician or chiropractor before a workplace injury. And typically those forms you can get from your workers' comp carrier. Then for your non-exempt employees, we want to make sure at the time of hire, we are providing them with the Wage Theft Prevention Act form. So that has a very long, fancy name, but all this form is it provides some information to the employee regarding their rate of pay, overtime rates, paid sick leave, and a few other entitlements. And then anytime we have an update to that information, so for example, maybe we give somebody a raise, we want to make sure that we are providing them with a new Wage Theft Prevention Act form that's updated within 7 days, and we also put a copy for their personnel file. Form DE-34 is not actually a form you distribute to your employees. It is what you file with the EDD to let them know that you have a new employee on your staff, and you can do that online. And then finally, if you are going to be paying anyone a commission in California, you're required at the time of hire to have a written commission agreement outlining the terms and how that commission is earned. Now, if you are a CEA member, you can access all of these forms in our employer new hire checklist. All right, another important concept in California is the definition of an employee. And we really need to get this right because our employees, if they're non-exempt, are going to be entitled to all of our wage and hour requirements that we're going to talk about in a little bit. Overtime, meal and rest breaks, and there's very steep penalties if we get those things incorrect in California. So an employee is anyone who performs services for the benefit of the employer. So California starts with that assumption that somebody who's working for you is your employee. And this includes minors and undocumented workers. Really, the only people who would not be entitled to all of the employee protections would be an independent contractor and interns. But for both of these categories, there's very specific tests that you need to satisfy. So for example, with interns, typically they would have to be receiving school credit. The program should be designed for their benefit. They shouldn't be displacing employees. So there's a multi-factor test that you would have to look at. I see a lot of employers get that wrong, where they bring on a minor and they call them an intern, but really that minor should be treated as an employee. Now, for independent contractors in California, we have what's known as this ABC test that, again, is going to presume that someone is your employee unless you can show that they satisfy all of the following. So they have to be free from the control and direction of the hirer, which means that they have a lot of autonomy and discretion in how they complete their work, when they complete their work. They need to be performing work that is outside the usual course of the hiring entity's business. That's the one where a lot of workers fail that prong of the test. Usually, when they're being hired, it's viewed that they're still performing or working towards the same goals kind of as the rest of the company. And then they need to be customarily engaged in a trade, occupation, or business of the same nature as the work performed, meaning they have their own independent trade, they're holding themselves out to other clients. They have to satisfy all of these prongs to be properly classified. We would recommend that anytime you are going to classify somebody as an independent contractor or 1099 worker, that you're consulting legal counsel, getting some legal advice on that, because there could be steep penalties for non-compliance in addition to all of the wage and hour issues that it could create. All right, so that leads us into our next section, our wage and hour guidelines in California. And I want to start with a discussion of minimum wage and salary requirements on a state level. So for your non-exempt hourly workers for 2025, they need to be earning $16.50 an hour. And every time the minimum wage goes up, our exempt salary minimum is also increased. It's 2 times the state minimum wage, and then you can multiply it by 2080 hours to get that annual rate. So remember, in California, for someone to be properly classified as exempt under the white collar professions of administrative, executive, and professional exemptions, they first need to meet a duties test showing that they're engaged in certain duties more than 50% of the time. They're regularly exercising discretion and independent judgment. The other part of the test is that they are meeting this salary minimum. For 2025, we are at $68,640, and we cannot prorate that if they're only working part of the time, for example. That's an absolute minimum that they would need to earn. So if we can't afford that in our budget, we would want to make sure that we reclassify that person as a non-exempt hourly employee. And we do have a great fact sheet for you at this bit.ly link that anyone can access that talks about if you do need to make that transition, what are some tips regarding documentation and how to communicate that decision to the employee that you're transitioning to non-exempt. So anyone in California can be non-exempt. That's always the default. For it to be exempt, you have to overcome those other hurdles. We also have over 40 local minimum wages in California, where when you have employees working out of certain cities or localities that have to be paid more than the state minimum wage. And what's really important to remember here is that local minimum wage is based on where the employee is physically working. So if you're sending employees out to different clients for job sites, you're always going to want to check that local minimum wage. Same thing with remote workers that might be working in a different city than where your office or headquarters is located. You want to check is there a local minimum wage there? A lot of these local minimum wages are in and around the Bay Area, but also in and around the LA area, which could be close to where you have workers. So just to give you one example, LA City has a minimum wage of $17.28, so quite a bit more than that $16.50 an hour. Now, a lot of these local minimum wages increase on January 1st each year, but there's a batch of them that increase around July 1 each year. So we want to also be checking for those mid-year increases. Again, we have a great fact sheet for you where you can check all of those local minimum wages to confirm that information for where you have workers located. And this local minimum wage, or the local minimum wages, do not impact that exempt employee salary amount. So that is tied to the state's minimum wage. All right, in California, we also have special overtime requirements. So in addition to that weekly overtime that we have on a federal level, we have daily overtime, we have double time, and we also have a special rule where it's all paid at overtime when someone is working a 7th day in a row in a work week. So I'm going to unpack all of these for you now. When do we have to pay time and a half? So we have to pay time and a half someone's regular rate of pay anytime they're working over 8 hours in a workday, that's daily overtime, over 40 hours in a work week, that's weekly overtime, and then for the first 8 hours worked on that 7th consecutive workday in a work week, that is paid at time and a half. Now, when do we have double time kick in? That kicks in if someone's working over 12 hours in a workday, and on that 7th consecutive day, if they go beyond 8 hours, then they kick into double time. Now, I want to take a minute to talk about this concept of regular rate of pay. This is really important in California, and I see a lot of employers get this wrong. They're well meaning, they're trying to calculate things properly, but it's a pretty complicated concept. Now, the regular rate of pay is the figure that gets multiplied by 1.5 or 2 times to calculate overtime. And if you have employees that earn any additional types of compensation beyond their base hourly rate, that's going to increase the regular rate of pay. And if you're using the base hourly rate to calculate overtime and you're not taking into account those additional forms of compensation, your overtime payments will be insufficient. And you can imagine how costly this can get if it's happening every pay period across all your employees. Wage and hour claims, most cases someone can go after you for up to 4 years. So it can get very expensive to get this wrong. So just to unpack this a little bit more, the regular rate of pay is going to take into account additional earnings such as commissions or piece rate pay. If you have shift differentials, so for example, if you say we're going to pay a higher rate of pay if you come and perform work on the weekend. Also, non-discretionary bonuses are a big one. So these are planned bonuses where the employee knows what they need to do to get them. So for example, if you service 20 cars today, we'll give you a $300 bonus. That's different than a discretionary bonus, such as the end of the year or Christmas time, where you decide to give people a bonus just as kind of general appreciation. That's different than a non-discretionary. But again, all of these can increase that regular rate of pay. If you look at the per hour value of that commission, for example, maybe you're paying someone $16.50 an hour, but when you factor in the commissions, it's really like they're earning $18.50 an hour. That would be the figure that we would have to use to multiply to calculate overtime. And there's also, depending on the type of additional earning, sometimes a slightly different calculation for coming up with that regular rate of pay. So it's really important that if you have these additional types of earnings, I would conduct an audit or have it reviewed by your legal counsel to make sure that your payroll system is tracking all of these things and calculating the regular rate of pay properly. All right, another really important concept when it comes to our non-exempt employees in California is rest breaks. And this is required that you, the employer, authorize and permit rest breaks for every 4 hours or major fraction thereof that's worked. They need 10 minutes net rest time. Now, the first time that I heard, oh, we're talking about fractions, like I went into HR, I don't really love math. What does that mean? I'll show you a chart in just a minute that breaks that down for you. Now, rest breaks need to be in the middle of each work period as practicable. So we cannot tack them onto the meal break. We also can't schedule them at the very beginning of the workday so that someone could show up late, or at the end of the workday so that they could leave. It needs to be in the middle of those work periods. And rest breaks are paid time. They're on the clock. So your employees are typically not clocking in and out for them. So we would recommend that your employees are certifying somewhere that they receive the rest breaks that they're entitled to. So for example, on their time card or in their payroll system, it's a really good idea to get that additional documentation. Now, let's say that you fail to provide a required rest break, or maybe it's interrupted by the supervisor with work-related questions. You now have not provided a sufficient rest break. Then the penalty is 1 hour of pay, known as premium pay, that you would have to give to the employee for their rest break being insufficient. And that premium pay hour needs to be paid at the regular rate of pay. So that concept comes back to haunt us, that we have to make sure that the regular rate of pay is being calculated properly. All right, so here is the breakdown. If someone works 0 to 3.5 hours, they are not entitled to a rest break. But if they work over 3.5 hours, then they're entitled to 1. If they work over 6 hours and up to 10 hours, they're entitled to 2. So for a regular 8-hour shift, you're looking at 2 rest breaks, and as we're going to learn, 1 meal period. And then over 10 hours, the 3rd rest break kicks in, etc. And we have to make sure, again, that we are relieving employees of all duties and relinquishing all control. So we should not be stopping employees with a quick work question. That's going to be considered an insufficient rest break. And we also have to allow our employees to leave the premises. All right, meal breaks, what's required? We need to permit a minimum 30-minute meal break. Anytime an employee is working more than 5 hours, they're entitled to that meal break. And here we have very strict timing requirements of when the meal break needs to start. It needs to start before the end of the 5th hour of work. So in plain language, what that means is the employee should be clocking out and starting their meal period by 4 hours and 59 minutes into their shift. If they are just a minute late, we are going to owe that hour of premium pay as a penalty. So you want to make sure that your supervisors are on top of this and scheduling meal breaks maybe at the 4-hour mark or 4-hour and 30 mark, so we're not running up on that deadline. Again, we need to relieve employees of all job duties. For the meal period, it's unpaid time, so they should be clocking in and out, and we should have very stringent records on that showing a full 30 minutes was taken for each meal period. Now, if someone's working less than 5 hours, again, they're not entitled to one. Over 5 and up to 10 hours, we're looking at 1 meal break. And then once we go over 10 hours, they get a second meal break that they're entitled to. The one last concept on wage and hour that I want to make sure to touch on is this PAGA reform that happened this past year. PAGA refers to the Private Attorneys General Act, and this is a law that allows employees to basically step into the shoes of our labor commissioner and sue an employer for wage and hour penalties that they experience or other employees experience. Now, there's been a lot of scrutiny about PAGA and how expensive it is for employers with those penalties stacking up. And they're now, after the reform, there's now new opportunities for employers to reduce their liability or penalties if they can show they were taking reasonable steps to comply with wage and hour laws. And then the legislature actually spells out what these reasonable steps are. So they want to see that employers are scheduling periodic payroll audits and taking action in response to those results. So again, taking a look at, do we have compliant meal and rest breaks? Are we calculating overtime properly? Do we have all the information that's required to be on the wage statement? And then if you see anything that's incorrect, that you correct that going forward. Distributing lawful written wage and hour policies to your staff. So ideally, if you haven't updated your employee handbook in a long time, take another look at that and have your employees specifically acknowledge those wage and hour policies. Training supervisors on wage and hour rules. So even though there's not a requirement to formally train supervisors on wage and hour, I would highly recommend that you do implement some type of wage and hour training that you're doing on an annual basis based on this new law. And then taking corrective action for supervisors who are not following your policies. So for those supervisors, for example, that are interrupting those meal or rest breaks, that we're following up with them and we're coaching or disciplining them on that. Now, CEA does offer a wage and hour package, audit package on our store at employers.org that can help you with your own wage and hour audit. It also does include a training for your supervisors on wage and hour. You can also give a call to the hotline if you'd like help locating where that is. All right, so now let's transition to leave laws and benefits. And leave laws is a really important area in California. As I mentioned, we have around 30 different leave laws that could apply, and all of them work a little bit differently. What's really important to know is your employee headcount, because there's going to be some leave laws that apply to all employers, but some only kick in if you have 5 or more employees or 25 or more employees. So you want to know what's your employee headcount. Also important to remember that some leaves run at the same time as one another, meaning concurrently, but others always run separately. So we'll talk a little bit about that today. So the first big one in California that applies to everyone is mandatory paid sick leave. And what we need to provide is 40 hours or 5 days, whichever is greater, per year for employees to address their own health needs or the health needs of their covered family members. And this is very protected time. If someone's using their mandatory paid sick leave time, we shouldn't discipline them for that. We should never count it against their attendance. Very protected in California. Now, we do have a couple different options in how we offer paid sick leave. So there's the lump sum method where we're just granting that 40 hours or 5 days at the beginning of the year, that someone may use or not, and then it resets on the same date every year. So if you use January 1, for example, then it resets on January 1 of the following year. So you don't have to worry about accrual or it carrying over, but there is an accrual option. And the default is that somebody earns 1 hour of paid sick leave for every 30 hours that they work for you. And in that case, it would have to continue accruing up to a cap of 80 hours or 10 days, although you could limit to someone to only using 40 hours. So you always want to check your employee handbook to see what does your organization provide in terms of paid sick leave. Now, paid sick leave does not need to be paid out at termination of employment unless you combine it with vacation all under one PTO policy. Vacation, unlike paid sick leave, does have to be paid out at termination. So once you combine it all, you have to pay it out. But if you have a separate paid sick leave policy, you don't have to worry about that. Now, for new hires, you can make them wait to use until the 90th day of employment to use that paid sick leave. In addition to a number of covered family members, a designated person is now also covered, meaning that an employee could select someone who's not a family member. It could be a close friend or a roommate that they could take sick time for. We also have a number of local ordinances that may have additional requirements. So again, you can refer to that local wage fact sheet that we have a bit.ly link for, and that will outline which ones have some local requirements as well. Pregnancy disability leave is another big one, and this applies if you have 5 or more employees either this year or you had 5 or more employees last year for at least 20 or more weeks. And what it provides is up to 4 months, the equivalent of 17 and a third weeks of job protected leave, where that employee also gets continued health benefits. Now, it doesn't mean that an employee is always going to get that entire 4-month period. It's whatever period of time their healthcare provider certifies them as disabled. And again, they'll have a right to return to their same job. We can require that they pay their share of the healthcare premiums during that leave, but we do have to continue their healthcare coverage. Now, the interesting thing about pregnancy disability leave is someone is eligible from the date of hire. So there's no length of service requirement. We might find out on day 1 of employment that they are pregnant and they have the certification from their doctor. We would have to honor that leave. Now, pregnancy disability leave runs concurrently with the federal FMLA if you have 50 or more employees. So you want to make sure that you're designating those leaves at the same time if they both apply. But it does not run at the same time as the California version known as the California Family Rights Act, or CFRA. And we'll talk about that in just a minute. But what that basically means is someone could take their PDL, and then once they recover from their disability, they would then still have CFRA available for baby bonding purposes if they meet the eligibility requirements. We also want to make sure, of course, that we are reasonably accommodating anyone with a pregnancy-related health issue, even when they're still working with us on the job. All right, so CFRA, the California Family Rights Act, again applies if you have 5 or more employees. And what this provides is up to 12 weeks of unpaid leave. And very similar to PDL, it has that right to reinstatement at the end of the leave and continuation of those healthcare benefits. But unlike pregnancy disability leave, there's a few more eligibility requirements when it comes to CFRA. Someone has to have worked 12 months for us, so there's that year of service requirement. And at the time they need the leave, you look back in the previous 12 months and you see, did they at least perform 1,250 hours for you? So they have to check both of those boxes to be eligible. And as I mentioned, CFRA runs separately from pregnancy disability leave. The two never overlap. So if you are a covered employer, you have 5 or more employees, you want to make sure that you have a CFRA policy. That's one of the mandatory policies that you need to have. There's also a CFRA poster that was updated by the Civil Rights Department this year. So make sure if you do have one of those great all-in-one labor law posters that it's updated for 2025. And then there's also mandatory forms that you have to use if you're administering this leave. All right, so what are the reasons that someone could use CFRA? I already mentioned the first one. Baby bonding is one of those reasons. So following the birth of a child or adoption or foster care placement, they have up to 1 year to use baby bonding leave. Also, if someone is dealing with their own serious health condition, and you want to be considering when someone's out on a workers' comp leave, whether they're eligible for CFRA or FMLA. Oftentimes, those leaves run concurrently with workers' comp. If they have a family member on active duty with the armed forces, then they could take leave for certain military exigencies, and then also caring for covered family members with a serious health condition. Now let's talk about how employees are paid during pregnancy disability leave or CFRA leave. These leaves by default are unpaid, but employees could use their accrued time that they have available. So for example, they could use their mandatory paid sick leave, or if they have vacation time, and they can also apply for wage replacement benefits through the state by applying with the EDD. So we already mentioned these when we were talking about the new hire forms. But paid family leave, when is that available? An employee could apply through the EDD when they are on leave, baby bonding, or caring for a family member, or for military exigencies. So you can see the same reasons that we just talked about for CFRA leave. It's up to 8 weeks of partial wage replacement, which could be 70 to 90% of that person's wages. And this is not protected leave time. So there's sometimes the misconception that paid family leave stands for a protected leave. You really want to look at this as just the money that someone could receive. State disability insurance, very similar. This is though for when someone is dealing with their own injury or health condition, and it's up to 52 weeks of pay in this case. But there is a 7-day waiting period before someone can get those SDI benefits paid out. All right, another important leave that's actually relatively new in California is bereavement leave. And again, this applies if you have 5 or more employees and you need to provide up to 5 days of unpaid leave upon the death of a covered family member. Now, there's a short length of service requirement to be eligible. Someone needs to have worked for you for at least 30 days. And there is a clock ticking on when someone can use this leave. They need to use it within 3 months of the date of the death. But they don't need to use all of those days at once. They could choose to break it up. You know, maybe they take 2 days off, come back to work, and then take another 3 for the funeral. They could do it that way. You can also request appropriate documentation, such as a death certificate, published obituary, document from a religious institution. You do have a right to do that as the employer. So as I mentioned, it is unpaid, but the employee could choose to use their accrued time off. And you also want to check your policy because a lot of employers might choose to provide some paid leave time, whether it's all 5 days or maybe 3 of the 5 days are paid. So you always want to check your employee handbook for that. Covered family members include spouse, domestic partner, child, parent, parent-in-law, sibling, grandparent, and grandchild. And the leave rights are per death, not per year. So there's no cap on the number of times that someone might take this type of bereavement leave. We also have reproductive loss bereavement leave in California, and it's very similar to the regular bereavement leave that we just talked about. So if you have 5 or more employees, then you need to provide these 5 days of unpaid leave time upon a reproductive loss event. And that is defined as a failed adoption, surrogacy, miscarriage, stillbirth, or unsuccessful assisted reproduction. And that can be used for either parent. Same eligibility requirement that someone needs to work for you for 30 days to be able to take this leave. But here are some differences than with regular bereavement leave. So in this case, you can cap it to 20 days of reproductive loss leave in a 12-month period, but you want to make sure you have that clearly in your employee handbook or in your policy that you're putting that cap on it. In this case, you cannot request certifying documentation. So our recommendation is to take the employee at their word if they are telling you that they had a reproductive loss event, because the law does not allow you, like the regular bereavement leave, to request a medical note for example. All right, vacation policies in California, to some people's surprise, are actually not required. So while we are required to provide mandatory paid sick leave, you are not obligated to provide vacation. Now, if you choose to do so, you can decide how much vacation time you want to provide, who's eligible for vacation. So for example, maybe you choose that it's only your full-time employees that are eligible to earn vacation. You can decide the parameters on it. But once you do decide to offer vacation, there's some very specific rules that apply because vacation is treated as wages. So a big rule is that you can't have a use it or lose it policy. So it has to continue to carry over from year to year. The employee either has to use it or it has to be paid out. And that includes at the termination of employment. Unlike paid sick leave, vacation does have to be paid out at the end of employment. We also have to put a reasonable cap, or we're only allowed to put a reasonable cap on vacation. And that's been interpreted to be 1.5 times somebody's annual rate or more. So to give you an example of that, let's say that you provide someone that they can earn up to 40 hours of vacation time in a year. 1.5 times that would be 60 hours. So you would have to allow a cap up to at least that. So they get to keep earning a little bit beyond that, just that 1 year period. We also have to make sure that we are applying those policies consistently across the employees who are eligible for vacation. Another really important thing to note, if you have any floating holiday policies where employees are allowed to use that time at any time in the year, that's very likely going to be viewed as vacation in California. And that means it is subject to vacation rules. It would have to be paid out at termination of employment. So take another look if you have a floating holiday policy. Make sure that it is aligning with vacation requirements. And then finally, I want to talk about CalSavers retirement. So what this is for California employers who do not offer a qualified retirement savings plan, such as a 401k, you have to enroll your employees in CalSavers, which is the state-run program. Now, employees can opt out, so they're automatically enrolled, but they might decide, you know what, I don't want to contribute to retirement savings. I want to keep my full paycheck, and so they could choose to opt out. Now, if you're an employer with 5 or more employees, it's already required that you either have a qualified retirement savings plan or that you're registered with CalSavers. If you have just 1 or more employees, then your deadline to register with CalSavers or let CalSavers know that you already have a qualified plan is December 31st of this year. So make sure you put that on your calendar if you're a smaller employer, that you don't miss that deadline. All right, so now let's transition to the end of the employment relationship and let's talk about the final paycheck requirements in California. So anytime that you are ending the employment relationship, whether you're terminating someone or whether it's a group layoff, whatever the circumstances are, pay is always going to be due on that last day of employment. And we recommend that you have that check in hand right as the words are leaving your mouth that you're terminated. We've heard of stories where the check wasn't in hand when someone was notified, they left the building, and then they didn't receive their final check. And the reason that this is important in California is we have what's known as waiting time penalties. So for every day that that check is late, that employee could go after a day's worth of wages all the way up to 30 calendar days. So that can be very steep. Now, anytime someone is resigning, voluntary quitting, and they give us more than 72 hours notice. So let's say they give us the standard 2 weeks notice. Pay again is going to be due on that last day of employment. Now, if they give us less than 72 hours notice, then we need to provide that paycheck within 72 clock hours after notice is given. So that's not business days, that's clock hours. Now, we never want to mail the final paycheck unless we have a resigning employee who has agreed to that final paycheck being mailed. They have to do that in writing and it has to be voluntary. In that case, if you do get that, then the date of mailing is considered that date of payment. So it does buy you a little bit of time. If you have that really quick turnaround time with 72 hours, you might ask that resigning employee, hey, are you okay with mailing that final paycheck? Can we get that in writing and get your address? Now, for final pay, it should always be a live check. So do not direct deposit it. Our DIR views it that any direct deposit agreement is void for purposes of the final check unless you get another agreement, a separate agreement for the final check to be direct deposited. And even then, you would still have to comply with these timing requirements. So we always recommend a live check for final pay. All right, now let's talk about termination paperwork. Luckily, we do not have the long laundry list that we have for onboarding, and that's a good thing because usually at the time of termination, we're probably trying to get people out fairly quickly. So the forms that we have to provide are number one, notice to the employee as to change in relationship. So this documents the date of termination, the circumstances around that, and what it's used for is if that person goes and applies for unemployment benefits, then this is going to be information that the EDD is going to ask for. We also have to provide the EDD for your benefit pamphlet anytime we're ending the employment relationship. This is also known as Form DE 2320, and it puts the employee on notice of unemployment insurance benefits. Even if you don't think they're eligible, you still need to provide this pamphlet. Most employers also have to provide the notice to health insurance premium payment, HIP notice, and then also COBRA forms regarding if someone had healthcare coverage with you, how they can extend or continue that coverage. Typically, it would be your carrier that would send out these COBRA forms to the individual, but you need to make sure to let your carrier know about that triggering event. So make sure to let them know about that termination or that person who has resigned. And again, if you're a CA member, we have the termination checklist that links to all of these forms on our website. All right, and in the last few minutes here, I want to go over California required trainings. We have a number of important ones in California. So we have harassment prevention training requirements. If you have 5 or more employees, mandated reporter. If you have 5 or more employees and you employ any minors in your workplace, then there are going to have to be certain employees that get this mandated reporter training. And then new as of last year, we have our workplace violence prevention plan requirements that also includes an annual training for your staff. So if you put that together last year, don't forget, you might be coming up on that deadline to train every year. And then we also have a new indoor heat illness standard that went into effect last year. And that includes a training requirement and a written plan as well. So let's go over each of these. So for harassment prevention training, what it requires is that you provide 2 hours of training for all California supervisors and above every 2 years. And for non-supervisors, they need to have 1 hour of training every 2 years. So if you last trained in 2023, you're going to be coming due in 2025. Now for new hires, they also have to be trained within 6 months of their hire date. Or for a newly promoted supervisor who maybe only got that 1 hour of training, they need to make sure to get that 2nd hour of training within 6 months of their promotion. And the training does need to be interactive and require participation of those who attend. So make sure you have a qualified training provider for that. And that is something that CEA can assist with. All right, let's talk about mandated reporter training. So this actually started with a law in 1980 known as the California Child Abuse and Neglect Reporting Act, or CANRA, and it requires certain mandated reporters to make formal reports to law enforcement when they learn about child abuse or neglect. And mandated reporters are typically those who work closely with children, such as teachers and coaches, etc. But it was recent that it was added to the list of mandated reporters. If you have a business with 5 or more employees and you employ any minors, then all of your human resource employees and supervisors of minors have to have this mandated reporter training. HR employees have to report all forms of abuse and neglect. Supervisors of minors under the law are only required to report sexual abuse that they learn about, but they could, of course, choose to report on those other forms of abuse. So we would recommend that you're giving this training annually. There can be criminal penalties and consequences if someone fails to make a mandated report when they're supposed to. And we do, again, have this training available through CEA. All right, let's talk about workplace violence prevention plan requirements. This went into effect last year, and it requires almost every California employer to have a written workplace violence prevention plan to try to reduce the risk of a violent incident happening in your workplace. Now, Cal OSHA has a template that you can use and customize to come up with your plan, and there's very, very limited exceptions regarding who this does not apply to. So just to give you an overview of the requirements that went into effect last year, employers should be maintaining their written plan, taking a look, reviewing, and updating it annually. Also, we need to solicit employee feedback on the plan. And also, if you have a union, we need to get their feedback on how they think we can mitigate hazards in our workplace. How can we report these types of incidents? And what should be in our annual training? Your employees might tell you, hey, I'd really love to have an active shooter scenario. It doesn't mean you have to have that in your training, but you can get feedback and suggestions from your staff, and that is required on an annual basis. You also need to conduct that annual employee training on your specific workplace violence prevention plan, and it needs to be by somebody that's knowledgeable in your plan. So it can tell employees at our workplace, where do we report these incidents? Where are our exits located, etc. We also need to schedule periodic hazard inspections, investigate any workplace violence incidents, and then if we do have a violent incident or we have a threat of violence, whether that comes from an employee or a customer or vendor, whomever it might be, we have to always record that on what's known as a violent incident log. So Cal OSHA does have FAQs and resources if you need more information on that. Now, we also have a brand new indoor heat illness standard that went into effect in July, and it applies to any indoor work area when temperatures would reach or exceed 82 degrees while employees are present. So if that is a possibility in your workplace, you want to make sure that you put together your heat illness prevention plan. There has been also a standard for outdoor workers for a number of years, I think since 2006. It's this indoor one that is new as of last year. And it does require this training for our staff on the prevention of heat illness. So we do have a website listed for you there where you can learn more information. I would put this together now. It's already starting to heat up, and you don't want to be in a situation where you wish you had it and then Cal OSHA comes knocking on your door. All right, so I know that we went over a lot of information in just an hour, so I kind of want to recap on some to-dos as we close out the training and reminders. So make sure that you're reviewing your onboarding paperwork, that you have all of the required onboarding notices, and then train your managers on best practices when it comes to what we are not allowed to rely on in the hiring process, such as salary history and criminal history restrictions. We would recommend that you are auditing your wage and hour practices on a frequent basis to put yourself in the best position if you do receive a wage and hour complaint. And then take a look at your leaves of absence policies in your handbooks. Make sure that you have comprehensive policies and that you're ready to administer leaves of absences as required, and then schedule those required trainings that we went over, like harassment prevention. All right, again, I want to remind you, if you do have any questions that come to mind after this training, you're more than welcome to take advantage of that HR hotline that is provided to you by Ventura County. So your number is 888-763-3174. So please call in. We love to hear from you. And then finally, if you need additional support beyond the hotline, I wanted to give you some information on membership with CEA. We do have membership as low as $125 a month, and that would give you access to all of our sample forms and toolkits, such as the leave forms, the new hire forms, etc. And then if you need a little more support, maybe you need some projects done, getting that handbook updated, you might consider joining as a Premier or Ultimate member. As Anna mentioned, we would love to get your feedback on how we did today and other training topics that you might be interested in. And Anna, I will let you close us out from here with our continuing education codes.
Sure. Whew, that was a lot in less than an hour. Give it up for Juliana. That was amazing. I just wanted to say that before we get to the continuing education credits. That was not easy to do. So kudos to you there. HRCI code today, 702355, SHRM code 25-FCEKS. CEAinfo@employers.org if you need any assistance or guidance on what to do with these codes. If you're eligible for certification, recertification, we're more than happy to guide you. You can always call that HR hotline provided by Ventura County as well. So with that being said, I want to thank Juliana for sharing your time and expertise in such a amazing fashion in less than an hour. Vicki and Eli, thank you for supporting us in the Q&A. And then again, to all of the entire team over at Ventura County for sponsoring this series. I did just put, if you have not been following in the chat, please hop over there right now, because I did just put the next training coming up on May 20th. That's going to be all about succession planning. So that's a really great training to have on your calendar. And I want to say thank you to you all for spending your morning with us. And we look forward to seeing you on May 20th. And just another reminder to please fill out that evaluation so that we know how we did and how we can better serve you in the future. Looking forward to working again with you soon. Thank you.